Good morning. I'm Bill Palmer. I'm the editor of Concrete Construction Magazine, and I'd like to welcome everybody to CC Live this morning. With us right now we have Tom Adams, who's the executive director of the American Coal Ash Association, where there has been some recent developments in the use of fly ash in concrete, and so we invited Tom to come by and talk with us about them. So, Tom, tell us a little bit, I guess, about what the most recent ruling was and what that's going to do for us.
Well, on December 19th, the EPA announced a regulation for management of disposal of coal ash that will be effective 6 months after that announcement is published in the Federal Register, so we're a number of months away from an effective date. This is actually a regulation they've been trying to write since 1980, so over 34 years EPA has been trying to figure out how to write a regulation that would manage the disposal of coal ash. The regulation, in terms of our interest in recycling the material into concrete products, the regulation doesn't have any effect on that at all. The EPA has announced they are going to manage coal ash as a non-hazardous material. For the last 5 years, we've been hearing that EPA was thinking about designating coal ash as a hazardous material. And the real motivation was to have enforcement authority over disposal. As a non-hazardous material, they don't have that authority, so they were trying to bring that in. The only way they could do that was to make that kind of a rule.
What was it that led to the potential of it being declared hazardous?
Well, this has been an ongoing battle with some of the anti-coal activists who feel that anything they can do to make the use of coal as a fuel for generating electricity more expensive, more onerous, and more difficult, that would help them in their efforts to shut down coal as a fuel for electricity. So as we had the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, the anti-coal environmentalists then had a sympathetic ear in the White House, and the administration directed EPA to move on this. It was kind of interesting that the planets kind of lined up because the massive spill at Kingston, Tennessee in December of 2008 focused attention on coal ash and enabled these folks that were interested in having that kind of a regulation to have some momentum and keep things focused on that spill, saying that we were really endangering human health and the environment, when in fact, if you look at the science, there is no science that's been brought forward that tells us coal ash is hazardous.
So what does this mean for the concrete industry? What's the new ruling? Is that going to be a good thing for us?
Well, the good news is, again, EPA is going to manage the material as a non-hazardous substance. The good news for the concrete industry is this removes that little black cloud, that stigma that's been following us around now since 2009 when they started this most recent rulemaking effort, where some owners were concerned about the possibility of hazardous waste regulations. Nobody wants to have a material in their building, in their pavements, in their bridges, and anywhere around them that's considered hazardous waste for any reason. There are multiple other effects a hazardous waste rule would have, including things like the removal from the building code that we all use, ACI 318. ACI informed EPA early on that if they declared the material to be hazardous waste for any reason, that they would have to move to take fly ash out of the building code, simply because the number one reason you have a building code is to protect the public health and safety. And by definition, a hazardous waste could not be included in a document that has that purpose.
So I know that the Coal Ash Association and others mounted a fairly vigorous campaign to combat this. Can you tell us a little about that?
This was the most important part in defeating a hazardous waste regulation. EPA and the Office of Management and Budget, in reviewing the EPA regulation, heard from every corner of the user community, from owners to state governments, state regulatory agencies, contractors, labor unions, ready-mix suppliers, everybody you can think of weighed in on this issue. And when particularly the Office of Management and Budget heard all the concerns that industry had, they paid close attention and they realized that hazardous waste rules would devastate recycling. And really the most interesting thing that happened on a federal level was when the Office of Management and Budget started to review the EPA's initial proposal in 2010, which is required by executive order. They contacted all the federal agencies that are stakeholders in the use of coal ash in their work: Defense, Agriculture, Bureau of Reclamation, Transportation, obviously. Every single federal agency that they contacted and asked them to comment on their proposed rule, which was a hazardous waste rule. Every single agency told the EPA, don't do this. You're going to cause us big trouble. And the only federal agency that wanted to do hazardous waste was EPA.
So for concrete, why is the use of fly ash a good thing?
Well, we certainly have decades of evidence that fly ash obviously improves durability of concrete, improves compressive strengths, flexural strengths, and we know it's the number one tool in dealing with ASR, alkali silica reactivity. So in order to combat ASR, particularly departments of transportation need to be able to get the material and use that to combat that. That's a very serious problem. The American Road and Transportation Builders Association did a study a couple years ago, contacted all 50 DOTs in the United States, and they said, what would it mean to you if you couldn't get fly ash for your projects? And they came back with an economic impact of over $5 billion per year. So it's obviously a very serious tool, particularly when departments of transportation are trying to battle ASR. Other things that, of course, it does, in plastic concrete, it will help improve pumpability, can help overcome some finishing problems. There are all kinds of great things it does for the contractor, but the ultimate durability and improving that durability is really where the big benefit comes. The fact that oftentimes people say, well, fly ash is a little less expensive than Portland cement, that's really not where the big bang comes. The big bang comes from taking a bridge. For example, in the 1950s, when President Eisenhower got the interstate highway system going, bridge decks during that period of time lasted 50 years. That was the outside service life you could get. Today, with fly ash, and other technologies that we have available to us, we can design bridges that last 75 to 100 years with no problem. And that's where the big bang for the buck comes from, by using fly ash in cooperation with these other technologies.
One thing I've always wondered about is as we see a little bit less power being generated through the use of coal, are we eventually going to see shortages of fly ash?
That's a great question, Bill. There's an interesting dynamic in the energy industry. We are seeing less coal being burned as natural gas pricing comes in and takes a share from coal. We're right now at about 35% of our electricity is generated by using coal. And that's really about where it's going to bottom out. There's a lot of factors that come into play. Number one, the utilities, because the capital cost for converting a plant from coal to gas are very, very significant. Utilities have to make a very careful decision when they go in that direction. The natural gas markets are very cheap right now. However, that may not last. If you look at the potential for export of natural gas to Europe and Japan and other places where they really rely on gas and the prices are significantly higher, once we get that capability, the gas is not going to be staying in the U.S. It's going to go offshore where they're willing to pay 5 to 6 times what we're paying in the U.S. for it. So in terms of looking at portfolios that the utilities have for their power plants, we're pretty much where we're going to be at for quite a while. So the supply of ash right now is changing for that reason, but also if you look at the power plants that are still using coal, there's been a lot of things in the media about plants closing. And to listen to some of the environmental groups, they would say, yes, we're having an impact, we're closing coal-fired power plants, when in fact the plants that are closing are small to medium-sized plants that have very old technologies in those plants. They don't meet current clean air standards, and to equip those plants with the scrubbers and the things that are needed to comply, it just doesn't make economic sense. So the utilities are closing these small to medium-sized plants which frankly were not being used except in peak periods, and that does not create fly ash that is really good for concrete products. So these plants were not servicing the concrete market to begin with. The big issue in this past few months where there had been some concern about supply was more a logistical issue than anything else. I think a lot of us heard stories about problems in certain parts of the country where you couldn't get rail service, you couldn't get water service with barges and that kind of thing. That impacted Portland cement, aggregates, and fly ash as well. So the logistical issues were more of a problem recently than anything else.
So does the Coal Ash Association expect to see an increase in beneficial use?
Well, certainly with regulatory certainty. If you look at the power plants that are interested in adding beneficiation equipment, which processes fly ash, makes it more marketable for concrete, the systems that do this work cost somewhere between $20 and $30 million per plant. The utilities are not going to invest in those kinds of technologies if there's a potential for hazardous waste regulation. Now that that's been determined, the investment in these beneficiation technologies is going to start picking up again. One other exciting thing that's coming on the horizon to help with the supply issue is there's a lot of interest right now in reclaiming ash that's been already put into disposal, particularly ash that's gone into ash ponds. Research has shown that in many cases the ash that's gone into ponds is perfectly suitable for use in concrete once you dewater it and process it appropriately. So there's a lot of people looking at this. In fact, just last month in South Carolina, Santee Cooper, one of the big utilities in South Carolina, started a reclaiming process with a company called the CEFA Group, where they're taking ash from a power plant, putting it through CEFA's beneficiation system. At the same time, they're bringing ash from 2 ponds on their site and feeding that into the system as well. So they're closing these ponds by taking that ash, putting it into the system, processing it, and making concrete grade fly ash out of it. That's just one example, and there's a whole lot of other people looking at that now. So the supply issue in the future is going to be aided by this really great environmental success story, because if you think about it, closing down an ash pond or closing down a landfill where ash is currently being stored is a great way to solve any kind of disposal considerations in the future.
Okay, well that's great. Anybody in the audience have questions or?
Are we actually producing more fly ash than what we're using currently in the United States?
Oh yeah, our association, the American Coal Ash Association, has been doing a production and use survey now since 1968, and every year we go out and contact the power plants that are burning coal, and we find out how much ash they're generating, what markets it's going to, what applications are using the material. Right now, we're using about half the fly ash that we're producing. The National Ready Mix Concrete Association did a survey, and they do surveys annually. And one of the things that came out of their most recent survey was ready-mix producers feel they could double their use of fly ash if they could overcome some things like bad specifications, product availability concerns, these kinds of things, contractor education. There's about 5 things that have been identified as primary concerns about enhancing the use of fly ash by the ready-mix producers, but the market clearly is there.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.